Well, we can almost see the light at the end of the COVID tunnel, and it will certainly be an interesting and challenging few weeks and months as we transition as a church out of lockdown. And for this reason, I've decided that we will focus our attention on some wonderful studies that were prepared by Rev Dr Peter Walker, Principal at the United Theological College, who invites us to explore the question of our purpose, our focus, and our identity as the church. I've asked Peter to offer us a short introduction to these studies, and I look forward to seeing you or worshipping with you on Sunday as we begin this work together.
Hello to everyone at Glenbrook congregation. It's so good to be with you, even if it's only in this way. I wish I could see you, but I'm glad you can see me. And I'm looking forward to hopefully being with you in person sometime next year. Reverend Ellie tells me that you're undertaking a set of studies that I originally offered to the New South Wales Synod meeting in 2019. So firstly, thank you so much. I'm delighted to know that those studies are still being used, and hopeful that there might be something in there for you as a community and for you personally. Ellie said I might introduce those studies with just some fresh thinking now, 2 years down the track. So I thought I'd do that by just telling you a little bit of why I chose the theme I chose, and then also what does it look like now that we're in this scenario of living with COVID. So the first thing to say is you'll see the theme for the three studies is living church. Now, I didn't choose that theme. That theme was provided to me. And the first thing to say is, to be honest, when I saw that theme, I thought, oh no, here we go again. Here's the church focusing on itself, wanting to talk about what it means to be a living church. And I thought, I'm going to try and work this around so that in actual fact, instead of looking at what's of secondary importance, us, we look at what's of primary importance, which is Jesus Christ. And so the theme Living Church found its way into my mind via the Synod office, and I began thinking about the fact that really what I want to do here is answer for myself and for the Synod, what does it mean to be the living church? And in actual fact, the answer to all three studies is the same. The living church is identified by the presence of the living Lord. So the three studies are the purpose of the living church, the focus of the living church, and the identity of the living church. And in each case, the purpose, the focus, and the identity is Christ. Secondly, I thought this might be helpful because one of the ways in which I've found myself worried for the uniting church, not worried because I'm lying awake worrying about us, but worried in the sense that, have we lost touch with something important, is as follows. We generally speaking embrace the idea of being a church for the world, which I think is absolutely wonderful. And that's fed into us from what were the secularizing theologies of the 60s and 70s in particular. Again, wonderful. That they called for the church to move out into the world, to look for ways of engaging in mission in the world, being a people of God for those in our communities around us. Splendid. But the question that I sometimes long to hear an answer to is, well, why? Why are we doing that? And I think the why is because Jesus Christ calls us to be that sort of church. So the reason we are a church of the world is not because we are losing touch with Christ, but in fact because we are catching up with him. The living church is the living church in the world because we are there with the living Lord. And maybe thirdly, if I was being honest, I sit in a lot of meetings, and sitting in a lot of meetings not hearing much of the language of the gospel. And I say at one point in one of the studies that one of the things that we learn from our first peoples is that one of the great travesties visited upon them is the loss of their language. And the reason it's so hurtful and harmful and disorienting is because to lose your language is actually to lose a sense of your identity. It's core to our identity, our language. And I just worried a bit that we in the Uniting Church are losing the language of the gospel and therefore perhaps losing a sense of our identity. So those are the reasons why I went with the studies I've gone with 2019. Here we are 2 years later, and we're a different church than we were then, and a different world than we were then. So three things to say just briefly. That I think what we've learnt during COVID is, or what I hope we are learning during COVID and can become, is a church that remembers we are a people who are called to embrace rather than exclude. That Jesus reached out to and included among his disciples those whom others excluded and marginalised. And that even in a pandemic scenario, we are called wherever we can to be a people who embrace others. We're called to answer the question, who is my neighbour? Afresh, every day. And the neighbour is the one whom others walk by. Secondly, we're also called to be a people who form community around the risen Christ. And what that means is also we need to provide a safe place for people to gather. So yes, all are welcome in the church that bears Christ's name, but there will be times when it's not safe for all of us to be in the one place. Now that's hard, but it's actually potentially tremendously creative, because it pushes us to find creative ways to form community, to shape worship, to offer hospitality, to provide pastoral care. And in doing that creative, we've never been here before type church stuff, we sometimes find a way to be the church into the future. We're not the first Christians to have endured trying to bear witness to the love of God in a world of widespread disease. The Antonine plague of the 2nd century killed about 10% of the population of the Roman Empire. And while the wealthy retreated to their estates, there's testimony to the fact that Christians stayed in towns and cities and cared for the sick because they believed that we are all created in the image of God. And during what came to be known as the Black Death, or the Great Plague of Europe in the late Middle Ages, John Calvin and Martin Luther, the great reformers, were known to have encouraged forming Bible study groups and worship groups in homes because they knew that small gatherings would mitigate against the spread of illness and disease. And Calvin himself lived through 5 outbreaks and ministered through them. And so we see witnesses who've gone before us who've shaped different ways of being church because they've lived through this sort of scenario. But the third thing we're called to be as church is we're called to be a people who are a people of hope in the midst of fear. And we do that, I think, by creating community and by embracing those who others exclude. I think by being a witness to that sort of community and that sort of people, we bear witness to the love of God that shines through the darkness. And when we are doing that, we are the sort of church that this strange world we're living in calls for. These things are fresh on my mind because I've just spent a day with our moderator who's preparing some resources for the church to think about being church in this new time. So you'll see some of those ideas coming out from the Synod office before too long. But they're my thoughts on what does the living church look like now compared to when I first spoke about this 2 years ago. So anyway, thank you so much again for engaging these studies, and I hope there's a word for you in them yourself and also for the Glenbrook congregation, and peace be with you.